On the morning of February 14, 1779, Captain James Cook, the greatest maritime explorer in human history, the man who had sailed farther than any person before him, who had mapped more of the Earth's surface than anyone who had ever lived, waded into the shallow waters of Kealakekua Bay carrying a loaded musket and a decision that would kill him. The Hawaiians fell upon him with clubs and daggers. His blood mixed with the Pacific surf as 4,000 islanders who had once worshipped him as a god tore his body apart on the black volcanic sand. Cook was 50 years old. In 11 years of exploration, he had connected the world's oceans, solved mysteries that had puzzled humanity for millennia, and opened the Pacific to European eyes. Now he lay face down in water that reflected the morning sky, another casualty of the violent collision between worlds that his own voyages had made inevitable. But James Cook had not been born for greatness. He was the son of a Scottish farm laborer raised in poverty so grinding that his survival to adulthood was itself remarkable. That this man, who began life mucking out stables and hauling coal in the brutal waters of the North Sea, would die on a beach 8,000 miles from home. Having revolutionized human understanding of the planet remains one of history's most extraordinary transformations. The story of how Cook rose from the Yorkshire dirt to command the Pacific, and why the people who had treated him as divine ultimately killed him, is also the story of how the modern world was born. For Cook's 3 voyages did more than add continents to European maps. They connected every inhabited place on Earth into a single, interconnected system for the first time in human history. The consequences, for science, for empire, for the indigenous peoples whose worlds Cook entered, continue to shape our planet today. This account draws primarily from Cook's own journals, meticulously kept throughout his voyages and published shortly after his death. These daily entries, written in Cook's careful hand by lamplight in cramped ship's cabins, provide our most intimate window into the mind of the explorer. They reveal a man of contradictions, methodical yet impulsive, respectful of indigenous peoples yet capable of shocking violence, humble about his origins yet increasingly imperious as his fame grew. Cook's journals are supplemented by the writings of his companions, naturalist Joseph Banks, astronomers William Wales and William Bailey, and the German naturalist Johann Reinhold Forster, whose observations would later influence Charles Darwin himself. The Hawaiian perspective on Cook's death comes from accounts collected by missionaries in the early 1800s, from eyewitnesses to that bloody morning, voices that remind us that exploration was never a one-sided encounter. If you enjoy this story, please make sure to subscribe for more videos. James Cook entered the world in 1728 in the village of Marton in Cleveland, a collection of stone cottages scattered across the Yorkshire moors, where the North Sea winds carried the smell of salt and coal smoke inland from the ports of Whitby and Scarborough. His father, James Cook Sr., had walked south from Scotland seeking work, carrying nothing but the clothes on his back and hands hardened by decades of farm labor. He found employment as a day laborer for Thomas Scottaway, a local landowner, and married Grace Pace, a local servant girl whose own family had known nothing but agricultural poverty for generations. Young James was the second of 8 children born into circumstances where survival was never assured. The cottage where he spent his first years had walls of rough stone chinked with mud, a thatched roof that leaked in heavy rain, and a single room where the entire family slept together for warmth. There were no books, no schooling, no prospects beyond the grinding cycle of agricultural labor that had trapped his ancestors for generations. In winter, when work was scarce, the family sometimes subsisted on turnips and oat porridge for weeks at a time. The landscape of Cook's youth was harsh but magnificent, rolling hills covered in purple heather, stone walls dividing fields where sheep grazed, and always the sea visible in the distance, gray and forbidding under Yorkshire's perpetually overcast skies. The North Sea was not the tropical paradise of the Pacific, where Cook would later make his name. It was a working sea, black with coal dust from the ships that carried fuel from Newcastle to London, treacherous with sudden storms that could dash a vessel against the rocky coastline without warning. When James was 8, his father's steady work and sober habits earned him promotion to farm bailiff on a larger estate. The family moved to Great Ayton, a slightly more prosperous village, where Thomas Scotove paid for James to attend the local school. Here, in a drafty stone building with wooden benches worn smooth by generations of farm children, James learned to read, write, and cipher, skills that would prove essential to navigation and that marked him as exceptional among his peers, most of whom remained illiterate throughout their lives. His schoolmaster, Thomas Richardson, recognized something special in the quiet boy from the moors. Cook was methodical and precise, qualities that served him well in mathematics. He possessed an almost mechanical memory for details, the distance between villages, the names of ships in Whitby Harbor, the patterns of tides and weather. More importantly, he showed an unusual capacity for sustained attention. While other boys fidgeted through lessons, Cook absorbed information with the steady patience that would later allow him to spend hours taking celestial observations or carefully plotting coastlines. But formal education ended abruptly when James turned 13. His father found him work in a general store in the fishing village of Staithes, a cluster of red-roofed houses clinging to cliffs above a small harbor where fishing boats bobbed at anchor. The shopkeeper, William Sanderson, needed a boy to serve customers, stock shelves, and help with accounts. James would live above the store, receive his meals and clothing, and learn the rudiments of commerce. Staithes opened James Cook's eyes to the wider world. The shop served fishermen, farmers, and merchants traveling the coastal roads. More importantly, it looked out over the harbor where ships arrived daily from London, Newcastle, and the European continent. James spent his free time on the quayside watching vessels load and unload, listening to sailors discuss voyages to the Baltic for timber, to Norway for fish, to the Dutch ports for manufactured goods. The mathematical precision he had learned in school found new application as he helped customers calculate quantities and costs, but his eyes kept drifting to the ships. After 18 months, William Sanderson made a decision that changed history. He had observed his young employee's fascination with maritime affairs and arranged for James to be apprenticed to John Walker, a Quaker shipowner in Whitby who operated a fleet of coal-carrying vessels. On a cold morning in 1746, 17-year-old James Cook walked the 20 miles from Staithes to Whitby carrying his possessions in a cloth bundle, stepping into a world that would forge him into the greatest explorer of his age. Whitby in the 1740s was a serious maritime town built around the brutal business of carrying coal from the northern mines to London's insatiable furnaces. The harbor reeked of coal dust, tar, and fish. Shipyards lined the river where craftsmen built the sturdy, flat-bottomed vessels known as cats that could navigate the shallow waters of the Thames estuary while carrying maximum cargo. These were not elegant ships. They were built for endurance, designed to survive the North Sea's winter storms while loaded with hundreds of tons of coal that made them heavy and sluggish but nearly unsinkable. John Walker recognized quality in his new apprentice immediately. Cook threw himself into learning seamanship with the same methodical intensity he had once applied to mathematics. He learned to read weather patterns, to judge the set of tides, to navigate by compass and dead reckoning. More importantly, he learned the particular skills required for coal ship navigation: how to handle vessels in the congested Thames, how to beach a ship safely for loading, how to maintain discipline among crews who were often the roughest men the maritime world produced. The work was brutally hard. Coal ships operated year-round, carrying their black cargo through North Sea storms that could last for days. Cook learned to work soaked to the skin in freezing spray, to sleep in cramped quarters that stank of unwashed bodies and coal dust, to maintain equipment with hands cracked from cold and rope burns. These ships lost men regularly to falls from rigging, to drowning when small boats capsized, to the lung disease that eventually killed many who worked too long in coal dust. But Cook thrived. His mathematical education made him useful for navigation. His steady temperament made him reliable in crisis, and his physical strength made him capable of the demanding manual labor that shipboard life required. Within 2 years, Walker was sending him on increasingly responsible voyages. By age 20, Cook was serving as mate on vessels trading as far as Norway and the Baltic ports. Most crucially, Cook spent his shore time studying. While other sailors drank and gambled away their wages, Cook borrowed books on mathematics, navigation, and astronomy from Walker's library. He taught himself to use navigational instruments, the quadrant, the compass, the log line used to measure speed. He studied the intricacies of celestial navigation, learning to fix his position by the stars with a precision that was unusual even among professional navigators. John Walker, a devout Quaker who believed in self-improvement, encouraged Cook's studies. He allowed his apprentice access to his collection of maps and charts, and more importantly, he introduced Cook to the broader Quaker community of merchants and intellectuals who valued learning and scientific inquiry. Through these connections, Cook encountered ideas that went far beyond the practical concerns of coal shipping. Theories about geography, discussions of recent voyages to distant lands, speculation about unknown continents that might exist in the southern seas. By 1749, Cook had completed his apprenticeship and was offered command of his own vessel in Walker's fleet. At 21, he could have looked forward to a prosperous career as a merchant captain, eventually owning his own ships and perhaps retiring as a respected Whitby businessman. The offer represented security, respectability, and social advancement beyond anything his laborer father could have imagined. Instead, Cook made the decision that launched him toward greatness and ultimate tragedy. In 1755, with war against France threatening and the Royal Navy desperately seeking experienced seamen, Cook walked into a Navy recruiting office in London and volunteered as an ordinary seaman, the lowest rank in the naval hierarchy. His friends thought he had lost his mind. Here was a man with 8 years' experience commanding merchant vessels, volunteering to scrub decks and haul ropes under the orders of officers who might be half his age and a tenth as experienced. The Royal Navy was notorious for its harsh discipline, brutal conditions, and deadly battles. Men were pressed into service against their will. They didn't volunteer to leave comfortable civilian positions. But Cook understood something his contemporaries missed. War creates opportunities for rapid advancement that peacetime never provides. The Navy needed officers who could actually navigate, and most gentlemen who received commissions through social connections possessed no practical seamanship. Cook's combination of mathematical education and extensive sea time made him valuable in ways that traditional naval training could not match. Moreover, Cook had spent 9 years studying charts and maps of every coast from Norway to Portugal. He had read accounts of earlier voyages to the Mediterranean, the Caribbean, the North American colonies. He possessed a geographic imagination that extended far beyond the coal routes of the North Sea. The Royal Navy offered access to voyages of exploration that no merchant captain would ever attempt. The transformation was remarkably swift. Within a month of enlisting, Cook's abilities had been recognized and he was promoted to master's mate. Within 2 years, he was master of his own vessel. When the 7 Years' War began in earnest, Cook found himself sailing for North America as part of the fleet assembled to wrest Canada from French control. The war that would decide the fate of North America was fought largely on and around water. The French controlled the St. Lawrence River, the crucial waterway that provided access to the heart of their Canadian territories. British forces under General James Wolfe needed accurate charts of the river's currents, depths, and hazards if they were to navigate their invasion fleet safely to Quebec. Cook volunteered for the dangerous work of surveying the St. Lawrence under enemy fire. Working at night in small boats, often within range of French artillery, he spent months taking soundings and making observations that would enable the British assault. His charts were so precise that they guided Wolfe's ships safely through waters that French pilots had considered impassable for large vessels. The Battle of the Plains of Abraham in September 1759 gave Britain control of Quebec and effectively ended French power in North America. Cook's navigation had made the victory possible, but more importantly for his future, his work had been observed by officers who recognized genuine talent when they saw it. After the war, Cook was assigned to survey the coast of Newfoundland, Britain's oldest overseas territory and one of the most dangerous waters in the world. Here, among the fog-shrouded Grand Banks where icebergs drifted south from Greenland and sudden storms could destroy ships without warning, Cook spent 5 years creating the most accurate charts ever made of North American waters. The work required skills that went far beyond ordinary seamanship. Cook had to master celestial navigation with unprecedented precision, learn to use the latest surveying instruments, and develop techniques for mapping coastlines under conditions where visibility was often measured in yards rather than miles. He worked methodically, checking and rechecking his observations, creating charts that captured not just the outline of the coast, but the depths of harbors, the location of dangerous rocks, the patterns of tides and currents. His Newfoundland charts established Cook's reputation throughout the maritime community. They were so accurate that they remained in use for over a century, guiding ships safely through waters that had claimed hundreds of vessels. More importantly, they demonstrated that Cook possessed the rare combination of mathematical skill, practical seamanship, and methodical patience that successful exploration required. In London, Cook's work caught the attention of two powerful institutions: the Royal Society, Britain's premier scientific organization, and the Admiralty, which controlled the Royal Navy. Both groups were planning an ambitious scientific expedition to the Pacific Ocean, and they needed a navigator who could be trusted with the most challenging voyage of the age. The Royal Society wanted to observe the transit of Venus, a rare astronomical event in which the planet Venus passes directly between Earth and the Sun, appearing as a small black dot crossing the solar disk. This phenomenon, which occurs in pairs separated by over a century, would next be visible on June 3, 1769. By observing the transit from widely separated locations and carefully timing Venus's passage, astronomers could calculate the distance from Earth to the Sun, a fundamental measurement that would unlock the scale of the solar system. The best observation point was Tahiti, an island in the Pacific that had been visited by European ships only once before. Getting there would require an 8-month voyage across largely uncharted waters, followed by months of waiting in an unknown land surrounded by peoples whose intentions toward Europeans remained unclear. But the Admiralty had a secret purpose that went far beyond astronomy. For centuries, European geographers had theorized about Terra Australis Incognita, a vast continent that must exist in the southern hemisphere to balance the known land masses of the north. Recent voyages had failed to locate this mysterious continent, but it might still exist in the unexplored reaches of the Pacific. The Admiralty wanted their Venus expedition to search for Terra Australis after completing the astronomical observations. This double mission, public science and secret exploration, required a commander who could navigate with scientific precision, maintain discipline during years away from home, and make contact with unknown peoples without starting wars that might jeopardize the expedition. The Royal Society and Admiralty needed someone with Cook's unique combination of mathematical education, extensive sea experience, and proven ability to work under pressure. In May 1768, James Cook received the commission that would transform him from an obscure naval officer into one of history's most celebrated explorers. He was appointed to command HMS Endeavour and lead the Royal Society's expedition to observe the transit of Venus in Tahiti. The ship chosen for this momentous voyage was, like Cook himself, built for substance rather than style. HMS Endeavour was a converted Whitby collier, one of the same type of coal ships Cook had sailed as a young man. At 368 tons and 98 feet long, she was sturdy but slow. Designed for carrying cargo rather than speed or elegance, Cook had specifically recommended this type of vessel because he knew their virtues: flat bottoms that allowed them to beach safely, capacious holds for storing supplies, and robust construction that could survive running aground on coral reefs. The Endeavour was refitted with additional guns, scientific equipment, and accommodations for the expedition's complement of scientists and artists. Joseph Banks, a wealthy young naturalist who had helped finance the voyage, brought a team that included botanist Daniel Solander, artists Sidney Parkinson and Alexander Buchan, and 4 servants. The ship also carried astronomer Charles Green, whose precise observations would be crucial to the Venus transit measurements. The total complement was 94 souls. Officers, scientists, marines, and common seamen drawn from the rough, waterfront taverns of London and Portsmouth. Many had never been to sea before. None had any idea they were embarking on a voyage that would last nearly 3 years and carry them farther from home than any Europeans had traveled before. Cook spent months preparing for departure with the methodical care that characterized all his work. He supervised the loading of supplies, tons of salt pork and beef, ship's biscuit, beer, rum, sauerkraut, and portable soup. He requisitioned the latest navigational instruments, including Harrison's marine chronometer, a revolutionary timepiece that would allow precise determination of longitude. He studied every available chart and account of previous Pacific voyages, memorizing the locations of islands, the patterns of winds and currents, the customs of indigenous peoples. Most importantly, Cook grappled with problems that no previous expedition had solved. How could a ship's crew remain healthy during years at sea? Previous voyages had lost half their men or more to scurvy, the mysterious disease that rotted gums, loosened teeth, and eventually killed sailors on long passages. Cook was determined to bring his men home alive. He studied the latest theories about scurvy prevention, assembled supplies of sauerkraut and malt that were thought to prevent the disease, and developed strict protocols for maintaining cleanliness aboard ship. Every aspect of shipboard routine, diet, exercise, sanitation, discipline, was planned with scientific precision. On August 26, 1768, HMS Endeavour sailed from Plymouth Harbor carrying James Cook toward his destiny in the Pacific. Standing on the quarterdeck as England's coast disappeared astern, Cook could not have known he was beginning a series of voyages that would map the Pacific Ocean, solve geographical mysteries that had puzzled humanity for millennia, and ultimately lead to his death on a beach 8,000 miles from the Yorkshire farm where his story began. But as the Endeavour's bow cut through the Atlantic swells toward Cape Horn and the vast Pacific beyond, Cook felt the satisfaction of a man who had found his true calling. After 40 years of preparation, from farm laborer's son to coal ship apprentice to Royal Navy officer, he was finally embarking on the voyage he had been born to make. The boy who had stared longingly at ships in Whitby Harbor was now master of his own vessel, carrying the hopes of British science toward unknown waters where no European had ever sailed. What he would find there, triumph and tragedy, discovery and death, glory and controversy that endures to this day, lay hidden beyond the horizon that beckoned from the Endeavour's bow. The greatest age of exploration was about to begin, and James Cook would be its most celebrated and controversial protagonist. The farm laborer's son was sailing toward immortality, though the price of that immortality would be higher than anyone aboard the Endeavour could possibly imagine. The Atlantic crossing revealed the quality of Cook's preparation and the character of his crew. While many naval expeditions began with chaos, untrained men, inadequate supplies, officers learning their duties as they went, the Endeavour sailed with methodical precision. Cook had drilled his officers in their responsibilities, established routines for everything from navigation to meals, and created a ship's culture that valued competence over social rank. The crew quickly learned that their captain was unlike any naval officer they had served under. Cook rose before dawn each day to take morning observations, personally checked the ship's position multiple times daily, and insisted on accuracy in every logbook entry. But he also showed unprecedented concern for their welfare. He enforced strict cleanliness standards, required regular exercise on deck, and introduced dietary innovations that previous captains had dismissed as unnecessary expense. The sauerkraut that Cook had loaded at Portsmouth initially met with sullen resistance. British sailors were conservative about food, suspicious of foreign dishes, and convinced that their traditional diet of salt pork and ship's biscuit was adequate for any voyage. When Cook ordered sauerkraut served to the crew, they refused to eat it, declaring it fit only for pigs. Cook's response revealed the psychological insight that made him an extraordinary leader. Rather than ordering compliance, he had the sauerkraut served only to the officers and petty officers, presented as a delicacy reserved for the ship's elite. Within days, the common sailors were demanding their share of what they now perceived as privileged food. Cook quietly ordered the sauerkraut distributed to all hands, and never again faced resistance to his dietary innovations. By October, the Endeavour had rounded Cape Horn and entered the Pacific, that vast ocean that Spanish navigators called the Peaceful Sea, despite its capacity for devastating storms. Cook now sailed waters that only a handful of European ships had crossed, following routes traced on charts so incomplete they were little more than sketches. The nearest European settlement lay thousands of miles behind them. The next lay thousands of miles ahead. Joseph Banks, the expedition's chief naturalist, recorded his first impressions of the Pacific with wonder that bordered on awe. "The sea," he wrote, "stretches in all directions without limit, blue as sapphires and calm as a mill pond. We have entered a world that seems created on a scale beyond human comprehension, but the Pacific's beauty concealed deadly challenges. Navigation required unprecedented precision. A miscalculation of even a few miles could mean missing Tahiti entirely and sailing into empty ocean until supplies ran out and the crew died of thirst." Cook spent hours each day with his instruments, taking multiple observations to verify the ship's position, cross-checking calculations until he was certain of their course. The Endeavour's passage across the Pacific demonstrated the revolution in navigation that Cook represented. Previous explorers had relied primarily on dead reckoning, estimating position based on compass course, speed, and elapsed time. This method accumulated errors that could amount to hundreds of miles over long passages. Cook combined dead reckoning with precise celestial navigation, using the sun and stars to fix his position with an accuracy that astonished even his experienced officers. More importantly, Cook possessed Harrison's marine chronometer, a precision timepiece that could maintain accurate time throughout a long voyage. By comparing local noon, determined by the sun's highest point, with Greenwich time shown on the chronometer, Cook could calculate longitude with remarkable precision. This capability, combined with his mathematical skills and methodical observations, allowed him to navigate with a certainty that previous generations of explorers could never achieve. On April 13, 1769, after nearly 8 months at sea, the lookout called the words that every soul aboard had longed to hear: "Land ho!" Rising from the Pacific's blue immensity, Tahiti appeared like a vision from paradise. Green mountains crowned with clouds, palm trees swaying over white beaches, and waterfalls cascading down volcanic slopes toward lagoons of impossible turquoise. But Cook's first challenge was not reaching Tahiti. It was getting ashore alive. The island was surrounded by a barrier reef that could crush wooden ships like eggshells. Spanish explorers had visited Tahiti only once before, in 1767, and their charts showed little detail about safe approaches. Cook spent 2 days carefully probing the reef, taking soundings and watching for breaks in the coral barrier before finding a passage that would admit the Endeavour. The Tahitians who paddled out to meet the ship presented Cook with his first test as a cross-cultural diplomat. These were not the savage cannibals that European imagination often conjured, but sophisticated people with complex social structures, advanced navigation skills, and understandable suspicion of foreign visitors. Their own legends spoke of white-skinned visitors from across the sea, but they had no way of knowing whether these newcomers came in peace or war. Cook's approach to first contact revealed the qualities that would make him the most successful explorer of his age. Rather than asserting dominance through displays of superior firepower, he came ashore with a small party, unarmed except for ceremonial swords. Rather than treating the Tahitians as subjects to be commanded, he attempted to understand their customs and show respect for their authority. When Tahitian leaders offered formal ceremonies of welcome, Cook participated with dignity, recognizing that these rituals created relationships that would determine his expedition's success or failure. The Tahitians were equally curious about their visitors. They had never seen metal tools, firearms, or cloth woven on European looms. The ship itself, a wooden structure larger than their largest war canoes, seemed to demonstrate supernatural powers. Some initially believed the Europeans might be gods returning from their legendary homeland across the sea. Joseph Banks recorded detailed observations of Tahitian society that revealed a civilization far more sophisticated than European prejudices had assumed. "These people," he wrote, "live in a manner that approaches closely to that of the golden age of poets. They seem to have few wants, and those easily supplied. They are remarkable for their beauty, their intelligence, and their gentle disposition towards strangers. The Tahitians practiced agriculture, constructed impressive stone temples called marae, and possessed astronomical knowledge that allowed them to navigate across thousands of miles of open ocean. Their society included hereditary chiefs, skilled artisans, and warrior classes organized along lines that Europeans could recognize and respect. Most importantly for Cook's mission, they showed genuine interest in European scientific activities and offered assistance with the expedition's work. Establishing the astronomical observatory required delicate negotiations. Cook needed a location with clear views of the sky, protected from potential interference, and positioned where his instruments would be safe from curious hands. The Tahitians understandably were reluctant to grant armed foreigners control of strategic positions on their island. After days of discussion through interpreters who spoke broken Spanish learned from earlier visitors, Cook and the Tahitian chief Tutaha reached an accommodation that satisfied both sides. The observatory was built at a location the Europeans named Point Venus, a promontory offering excellent sightlines and natural defenses. Cook established a fortified compound that included the astronomical instruments, storage for supplies, and quarters for the scientific party. Marines stood guard, but more importantly, Cook established friendly relationships with local leaders that made the Tahitians partners in protecting the expedition rather than potential enemies. As the transit of Venus approached, tension aboard the Endeavour increased. The entire voyage's scientific justification rested on successfully observing this rare astronomical event. If clouds obscured the sky on June 3rd, if the instruments failed, if some unforeseen disaster prevented accurate measurements, months of effort and substantial expense would be wasted. Moreover, the transit would not occur again until 1874. No one currently alive would have another opportunity. Cook supervised preparations with obsessive attention to detail. Multiple telescopes were set up and carefully calibrated. Timing mechanisms were tested and synchronized. Backup plans were developed for every conceivable problem. Charles Green, the expedition's astronomer, worked closely with Cook to ensure that observations would be taken from multiple positions, allowing cross-checking of results. The night before the transit, Cook wrote in his journal, "All our preparations are complete. The weather has been favorable, and we have every reason to expect clear skies tomorrow. The instruments are in perfect order, the observers are well trained in their duties, and our Tahitian friends have promised to maintain quiet during the crucial hours. If we succeed tomorrow, this voyage will have justified itself. If we fail, we must content ourselves with having made every effort that human skill and care could provide." June 3rd, 1769, dawned clear and calm. As the sun rose over Tahiti's mountains, Cook and his team took their positions at carefully placed telescopes, chronometers at hand, ready to time Venus's passage across the solar disk with unprecedented precision. At 9:25 in the morning local time, the planet appeared as a small black dot touching the sun's edge. Contact had begun. For the next 6 hours, Cook and his astronomers maintained constant observation, timing each phase of Venus's transit and recording measurements that would allow calculation of the Earth-Sun distance. The Tahitians watched with respectful curiosity as the Europeans stared intently through their strange devices, occasionally calling out numbers that scribes recorded in careful handwriting. When Venus completed its passage at 3:14 in the afternoon, Cook felt the satisfaction of a mission accomplished. "We have observed the whole passage of the planet Venus over the sun's disk," he wrote. "Our measurements appear accurate and consistent. The principal object of our voyage has been achieved." But Cook's secret orders contained a second mission that would prove far more historically significant than the Venus observations. After completing the astronomical work, he was instructed to sail south in search of Terra Australis Incognita. the great southern continent that European geographers believed must exist to balance the world's land masses. For 2 centuries, the most learned men in Europe had insisted that a vast continent lay hidden in the southern Pacific. Ancient Greek philosophers had reasoned that such a landmass was necessary for global stability. Medieval scholars had incorporated Terra Australis into their world maps. Even the great geographer Alexander Dalrymple, who had helped plan Cook's voyage, believed this mysterious continent might contain 50 million inhabitants and offer unlimited opportunities for trade. Cook was skeptical. His practical experience suggested that the Pacific was far larger and emptier than theoretical geographers assumed. But orders were orders, and the search for Terra Australis would allow him to explore regions no European had ever seen. On July 13, 1769, the Endeavour sailed from Tahiti carrying fresh water, tropical fruits, and fond farewells from Tahitian friends who had become genuinely attached to their European visitors. Several Tahitians requested passage to England, curious to see the homeland of these strange but likable foreigners. Cook agreed to take Tupaya, a Tahitian navigator and priest whose knowledge of Pacific islands would prove invaluable in the months ahead. Tupaya represented the sophisticated maritime culture that had flourished in the Pacific for over 1,000 years. Polynesian navigators had colonized islands scattered across an ocean larger than all the Earth's land masses combined, crossing thousands of miles of open water in double-hulled canoes, using techniques that European sailors barely understood. They navigated by reading wave patterns, wind directions, and stellar positions with a precision that equaled anything European science could achieve. Cook recognized Tupaya's value immediately. The Tahitian could identify islands that appeared on no European chart, predict weather patterns specific to Pacific waters, and communicate with indigenous peoples across a vast region. More importantly, Tupaya understood ocean navigation in ways that complemented Cook's mathematical approach. Where Cook relied on instruments and calculations, Tupaya read the sea itself, the color of water indicating depth, the behavior of birds suggesting nearby land, the feel of swells revealing distant storms. The Endeavour sailed south from Tahiti into waters no European had ever crossed. Day after day, the ship pushed into empty ocean, searching for signs of the great southern continent. Cook's charts showed vast blank spaces labeled Terra Australis Incognita, or simply unknown land. But the reality was endless blue water stretching to every horizon. After weeks of fruitless searching, Cook made a decision that demonstrated both his scientific honesty and his willingness to challenge established authority. Despite explicit orders to find Terra Australis, despite centuries of European conviction that such a continent existed, Cook concluded that the theoretical landmass was a fantasy. "I have sailed over much of the area where geographers place their imaginary continent," he wrote. "If Terra Australis exists, it lies much farther south than anyone has supposed, in regions so cold and remote that they would be of little value to navigation or commerce." Having demolished one geographical myth, Cook turned toward a more promising objective. Spanish charts showed a large landmass called New Zealand far to the southwest, visited once by Dutch explorer Abel Tasman in 1642. Tasman had sailed along the western coast but never determined whether New Zealand was an island or part of a larger continent. Cook decided to investigate this mysterious land thoroughly. On October 6, 1769, the lookout spotted high mountains rising from the sea, New Zealand's North Island appearing through morning mist like a revelation. Cook had discovered a land that would prove larger than England, uninhabited by Europeans and occupied by the Maori, a Polynesian people whose warrior culture presented challenges entirely different from Tahiti's peaceful reception. The Maori who approached the Endeavour in their war canoes were magnificent and terrifying. Tall, powerfully built men with faces tattooed in intricate patterns, they paddled vessels decorated with carved figures that seemed to snarl defiance at the foreign ship. Their leader stood in the bow of the largest canoe, wearing a cloak of kiwi feathers and holding a greenstone war club that gleamed like jade in the sunlight. First contact nearly ended in disaster. When Cook sent a boat ashore to take on fresh water, Maori warriors attacked without warning, killing one of the Endeavour's crew with a spear thrust that pierced his heart. Cook faced a crisis that tested every aspect of his leadership. He needed water and supplies, but he could not allow attacks on his men to go unanswered, yet excessive retaliation might trigger a war that would doom his expedition. Cook's response revealed the complexity of his character. He ordered musket fire that killed several Maori warriors, showing that European weapons made resistance futile, but then immediately sought communication with Maori leaders, using Tupaia as interpreter. The Tahitian navigator proved invaluable, as the Maori language shared enough similarities with Tahitian that basic communication was possible. Through Tupaia, Cook learned that he had stumbled into a complex political situation. The Maori were not a unified people, but numerous tribes frequently at war with each other. Some were willing to trade with the Europeans. Others viewed any foreign presence as an intolerable invasion. Cook would need to navigate these divisions carefully if he hoped to complete his survey of New Zealand's coastline. Over the following months, Cook circumnavigated both islands of New Zealand, creating charts that revealed the country's true size and shape for the first time. The work required extraordinary seamanship, as New Zealand's coast combined treacherous rocky shores, violent storms, and currents that could drive ships onto reefs without warning. Cook's Whitby training served him well. These were conditions similar to the North Sea, where he had learned to handle ships in dangerous waters. The survey of New Zealand established Cook's reputation as the most skilled navigator of his generation. His charts were so accurate that they remained standard references for over a century. More importantly, his systematic approach, taking multiple observations, cross-checking calculations, recording detailed notes about currents and hazards, created a new standard for maritime exploration. But Cook's greatest discovery was not geographical, but anthropological. The Maori represented a sophisticated warrior society that had developed in complete isolation from European influence. They practiced advanced agriculture, constructed impressive fortifications, and possessed technologies, like the working of greenstone, that Europeans could barely understand. Their social organization, religious beliefs, and military tactics offered insights into human cultural development that fascinated the expedition's naturalists. Joseph Banks recorded extensive observations of Maori culture, with a mixture of admiration and unease. These people, he wrote, possess courage, intelligence, and artistic skills that command respect. Their weapons are beautifully crafted, their fortifications are ingeniously designed, and their war dances are terrifying in their intensity. They seem to live constantly prepared for battle, yet they show great kindness to children and deep respect for their elders. The Maori's reception of Cook varied dramatically from tribe to tribe. Some welcomed trade opportunities, exchanging greenstone ornaments and finely woven cloaks for iron tools and cloth. Others remained hostile, viewing any European presence as a threat to their territorial authority. Cook learned to approach each encounter cautiously, prepared for either friendship or violence. By March of 1770, Cook had completed his circumnavigation of New Zealand and proved it consisted of two large islands rather than part of a continental landmass. His next decision would have consequences that reverberate to this day. Rather than sailing directly home across the Pacific, Cook chose to continue exploring, following the coast of what is now Australia, a continent that would become Britain's most important overseas territory. The eastern coast of Australia had never been visited by Europeans when Cook began his survey in April 1770. Captain William Dampier had explored parts of the western coast in 1699, describing it as a barren wasteland inhabited by the most miserable people in the world. But the eastern regions remained completely unknown, blank spaces on European maps that might contain anything from desert to paradise. What Cook found exceeded his most optimistic expectations. The coast that he would name New South Wales revealed a land of extraordinary beauty and apparent abundance. Vast forests stretched inland from magnificent beaches. Rivers provided fresh water, Native animals, kangaroos, koalas, exotic birds seemed to exist nowhere else on Earth. The climate was temperate, the soil appeared fertile, and harbors offered excellent anchorage for ships. Most remarkably, this enormous land seemed almost empty of human inhabitants. Cook's crew encountered small groups of Aboriginal peoples, but their population appeared tiny compared to the vast territories they occupied. To European eyes, accustomed to crowded landscapes where every acre was claimed and cultivated, Australia seemed like an empty continent waiting for settlement. Cook could not have known that he was observing the remnants of the world's oldest continuous civilization. The Aboriginal peoples had inhabited Australia for over 60,000 years, developing sophisticated systems for managing the landscape through controlled burning, complex knowledge of seasonal cycles, and spiritual beliefs that connected them intimately to their environment. Their apparent emptiness reflected sustainable population levels rather than primitive development. The cultural collision between Cook's expedition and Aboriginal peoples revealed the profound misunderstandings that would characterize European indigenous relations for centuries to come. The Europeans saw unused land that could support large populations if properly developed. The Aboriginal peoples saw ancestral territories managed according to spiritual laws that had maintained ecological balance for millennia. Joseph Banks recorded his impressions of Aboriginal society with typical European condescension, mixed with grudging admiration. The natives appear to live in the most primitive manner, he wrote, without houses, without clothing, apparently without government or law. Yet they seem perfectly adapted to their environment, moving through the landscape with an ease and confidence that suggests deep familiarity with its resources. Cook's survey of the Australian coast proceeded smoothly until disaster struck in the form of the Great Barrier Reef. On the night of June 11, 1770, the Endeavour ran hard aground on coral that tore a gaping hole in her hull. Water poured into the ship's hold as the crew fought desperately to keep her afloat. For several terrifying hours, it seemed likely that Cook's expedition would end with all hands drowned in the Coral Sea, their discoveries lost forever. The crisis revealed Cook's qualities as a leader under extreme pressure. While lesser commanders might have panicked, Cook methodically organized damage control efforts, directing the crew to jettison heavy items, including several cannons, to lighten the ship. He had divers examine the hull damage, supervised attempts to plug the holes with canvas and oakum, and maintained calm authority even as water continued rising in the hold. The Endeavour's salvation came through a combination of seamanship, luck, and Aboriginal assistance. Cook managed to refloat the ship at high tide and beach her in a protected river mouth, where repairs could be attempted. Local Aboriginal peoples, initially wary of the strange visitors, eventually provided crucial help by showing the Europeans sources of fresh water and edible plants that prevented starvation during the 7 weeks required for repairs. This extended contact gave Cook's party their most detailed exposure to Aboriginal culture. They observed hunting techniques using spears and woomeras, witnessed ceremonies involving complex body painting and ritual dances, and marveled at the Aboriginal people's encyclopedic knowledge of their environment. Every plant, animal, and landscape feature had names, uses, and associated stories that reflected thousands of years of accumulated wisdom. Yet cultural barriers remained largely impermeable. The Aboriginal people's nomadic lifestyle, lack of permanent agriculture, and absence of European-style government structures led Cook to conclude that they had no legal claim to the territories they occupied. This judgment, based on European legal concepts that equated land ownership with permanent settlement and cultivation, would justify the later British colonization that displaced Aboriginal peoples from their ancestral territories. By August 1770, the Endeavour was seaworthy enough to continue her voyage. Cook sailed north along the Australian coast, threading between the Great Barrier Reef and the mainland in a navigation challenge that tested his skills to the limit. The reef system, composed of living coral that could tear the bottom from any ship, required constant vigilance and precise seamanship. One mistake would mean disaster in waters far from any hope of rescue. Cook's successful navigation of the Great Barrier Reef represented one of history's greatest feats of seamanship. Using small boats to scout ahead, taking constant soundings to measure water depth, and anchoring each night in protected waters, he guided the Endeavour through hundreds of miles of coral mazes without further serious damage. His charts of the reef system remain the standard reference for navigators well into the 20th century. On August 22, 1770, Cook reached the northernmost point of Australia and made one of the most consequential decisions in imperial history. Standing on a small island that he named Possession Island, Cook formally claimed the entire eastern coast of Australia for Great Britain, despite the presence of indigenous peoples who had occupied the land for 60 millennia. The ceremony was brief but momentous. With his officers and Marines drawn up in formation, Cook read a formal proclamation asserting British sovereignty over the territory he had explored. The Union Jack was raised while Marines fired a ceremonial volley. Joseph Banks planted a British flag and carved the king's initials into a tree. In European legal terms, 1/3 of a continent had just changed ownership. Cook's claim to Australia was based on the legal fiction of terra nullius, the assumption that lands not occupied according to European standards of settlement and agriculture were legally empty and available for appropriation by the first European power to discover them. This doctrine ignored Aboriginal peoples' complex systems of territorial management and spiritual connection to their lands, but it provided the legal justification for British colonization that would follow 18 years later. The Endeavour now faced the long voyage home across the Indian Ocean, around the Cape of Good Hope, and back to England. Cook chose to sail through the dangerous waters of Torres Strait, the narrow passage between Australia and New Guinea that Spanish explorers had discovered but never successfully navigated. The strait offered the shortest route home, but it was notorious for reefs, variable currents, and violent storms that had claimed several ships. Cook's passage through Torres Strait demonstrated once again his superior navigation skills. Where other commanders had failed, Cook succeeded through methodical preparation, careful observation, and disciplined seamanship. He proved that the strait could be safely navigated by competent mariners, opening a crucial shipping route between the Pacific and Indian Oceans. The remainder of the voyage home tested the crew's endurance rather than Cook's navigation. Tropical diseases struck as the ship crossed the Indian Ocean. Dysentery killed several men, while others suffered from fever, scurvy symptoms, and infections contracted in the humid climates of Southeast Asia. Cook's dietary innovations had prevented scurvy during the Pacific crossing, but they could not protect against tropical illnesses that European medicine barely understood. By the time the Endeavour reached Cape Town for reprovisioning, Cook had lost 7 men to disease, a remarkably low death toll for such an extended voyage. But each loss reminded the survivors how far they remained from home. The Cape Colony, Britain's strategic outpost controlling the sea route to India, seemed like civilization after months in the tropical wilderness, but it was still thousands of miles from England. The final leg across the Atlantic proved surprisingly dangerous. Winter storms battered the ship as she struggled northward through seas that seemed intent on claiming the expedition when it was almost home. The Endeavour, her hull patched from the coral damage and her rigging strained by 3 years at sea, labored through mountainous waves that would have challenged a new vessel. On July the 12th, 1771, nearly 3 years after sailing from Plymouth, the Endeavour anchored in the Downs off the English coast. Cook had completed one of history's most successful voyages of exploration, mapping the coasts of New Zealand and eastern Australia, making crucial astronomical observations and establishing contact with previously unknown peoples. He had sailed farther than any explorer before him and returned with discoveries that would reshape European understanding of the world. But success brought new challenges. Cook's journals and charts contained information of immense strategic value to British interests. His discovery of New Zealand and Australia opened possibilities for trade, settlement, and naval bases that could secure Britain's position in the Pacific. The Royal Navy and Colonial Office immediately began planning future expeditions to exploit Cook's discoveries. Cook himself found peacetime naval service unbearably tedious after the excitement of Pacific exploration. He had tasted the intoxicating satisfaction of sailing into unknown waters, of adding new lands to the world's maps, of solving geographical mysteries that had puzzled humanity for centuries. The routine duties of a naval captain in home waters could never provide the same fulfillment. Within months of his return, Cook was promoted to commander and awarded a pension in recognition of his achievements. But retirement held no appeal for a man who had found his true calling in the Pacific's vast spaces. When the Admiralty began planning a second voyage to complete the exploration of the southern seas, Cook volunteered to command it, knowing that such an expedition would carry him even farther from home and deeper into unknown dangers. The boy from Yorkshire, who had once stared longingly at ships in Whitby Harbor, was now Britain's most celebrated explorer, but fame had not satisfied his hunger for discovery. The Pacific still held mysteries, islands that might exist but had never been found, passages that might connect oceans, peoples who had never seen European faces. Cook would return to solve these riddles, even though each voyage carried him closer to the violent death that awaited him on a beach in Hawaii. The man who returned to London in July 1771 was no longer the obscure naval officer who had departed 3 years earlier. James Cook had become a celebrity, his name spoken in the drawing rooms of Mayfair and the taverns of Portsmouth with equal fascination. The Royal Society elected him a Fellow, an extraordinary honor for a man born to agricultural poverty. King George III granted him a personal audience, questioning the explorer for hours about his discoveries while examining charts that revealed coastlines no European monarch had ever imagined. Yet fame sat uneasily on Cook's shoulders. He had never sought public attention, preferring the company of his instruments and charts to the social obligations that celebrity demanded. When fashionable London invited him to dinner parties where he was displayed like an exotic specimen, Cook endured the attention with polite discomfort. He spoke in the direct, unadorned language of a practical seaman, describing wonders that reduced his listeners to awed silence with the same matter-of-fact precision he used to record wind directions in his log. The scientific community embraced Cook with genuine enthusiasm. His precise observations, detailed charts, and methodical approach to exploration represented everything the Age of Enlightenment valued. The Royal Society published his journals, making his discoveries available to scholars across Europe. French philosophers praised his humanitarian treatment of indigenous peoples. German naturalists marveled at the new species he had collected. Spanish officials secretly studied his charts, recognizing that British exploration threatened their Pacific monopoly. But it was the Admiralty's reaction that mattered most to Cook's future. Lord Sandwich, the First Lord of the Admiralty, understood immediately that Cook's discoveries had shifted the global balance of power. Britain now possessed detailed knowledge of Pacific waters that Spain had considered its private domain. The coasts of New Zealand and Australia offered potential bases for British fleets that could threaten Spanish trade routes and challenge French expansion in the Indian Ocean. More tantalizing still were the gaps in Cook's achievements. He had proven that Terra Australis Incognita, the great southern continent of European imagination, did not exist in tropical latitudes, but vast regions of the southern Pacific remained unexplored. A continent might still exist farther south in the icy waters below the latitudes Cook had reached. The question tormented geographers and strategists alike. What lay hidden in the Earth's most remote seas? The answer would require another voyage, more dangerous than the first. Any expedition seeking the true limits of the Southern Ocean would have to sail into regions where winter temperatures could freeze rigging solid and ice could crush wooden ships like toys. Previous explorers had turned back when they encountered the first icebergs. Cook would need to push beyond the ice into waters no human had ever seen. Planning began within weeks of the Endeavour's return. The Admiralty authorized a 2-ship expedition equipped with the latest scientific instruments and provision for voyages that might last 4 years. The primary mission was to settle the question of southern lands once and for all, either by discovering the hypothetical continent or by proving definitively that it did not exist. Secondary objectives included astronomical observations, natural history collections, and continued exploration of Pacific islands that Cook had glimpsed but not visited thoroughly. The ships chosen for this ambitious undertaking were again converted Whitby colliers, selected for the same reasons Cook had recommended the endeavor. HMS Resolution, the expedition's flagship, displaced 462 tons and carried a complement of 112 men. HMS Adventure, the consort vessel, was smaller at 336 tons with 81 crew members. Both ships underwent extensive modifications, their hulls strengthened against ice damage and their holds configured to store the massive quantities of supplies required for extended voyages. Cook supervised every aspect of the preparations with the obsessive attention to detail that had made his first voyage successful. He personally inspected provisions, tested equipment, and interviewed potential crew members. The expedition would carry improved versions of every innovation from the Endeavour voyage: better preserved foods, more effective medicines, advanced navigational instruments, and artistic materials for recording discoveries. Most significantly, Cook insisted on carrying Harrison's improved chronometers, precision timepieces that would allow accurate determination of longitude throughout the voyage. Previous expeditions had relied on lunar observations for longitude calculations, a method that required clear skies and complex computations that could introduce dangerous errors. The chronometers would provide constant, reliable positioning that was essential for navigating unknown waters where miscalculations could mean sailing into ice fields or missing crucial landfalls. The scientific complement rivaled that of any expedition in history. Johann Reinhold Forster, a German naturalist of formidable learning, would serve as the expedition's principal scientist, accompanied by his son Georg, a talented artist and writer whose observations would later influence the Romantic movement. William Hodges, a landscape painter trained in the latest techniques, would create visual records of unprecedented accuracy and beauty. Anders Sparman, a Swedish naturalist, would focus on botanical collections that might yield new medicines or economically valuable species. The human dynamics of the expedition promised to be more complex than those of Cook's first voyage. Johann Forster was a brilliant but difficult man, prone to intellectual arrogance and conflicts with authority. He had quarreled with previous employers, demanded extensive privileges for himself and his son, and made clear his belief that the expedition's scientific goals outweighed its naval obligations. Cook, accustomed to unquestioned command, would need to manage a subordinate who considered himself the voyage's true leader. On July 13, 1772, exactly 1 year and 1 day after the Endeavour's return, HMS Resolution and HMS Adventure sailed from Plymouth carrying Cook toward discoveries that would surpass even his first voyage's achievements. The crowds that gathered to watch their departure understood they were witnessing history. These ships would sail farther south than any vessels had ever traveled, into regions where survival itself would be an accomplishment. The expedition's first destination was the Cape of Good Hope, Britain's strategic outpost at the southern tip of Africa. The voyage south revealed how thoroughly Cook had learned from his previous experience. The crews remained remarkably healthy. The ships handled beautifully despite heavy loads, and navigation proceeded with mechanical precision. Cook's reputation preceded him at every port, where officials competed to assist the famous explorer. At Cape Town, Cook received intelligence that heightened the voyage's competitive elements. French explorer Marion Dufresne was somewhere in the southern Indian Ocean, searching for the same hypothetical continent that Cook intended to find. If French navigators reached undiscovered lands first, they could claim them for France and deny Britain the strategic advantages that Cook's discoveries might provide. The race for the southern continent had acquired international dimensions. Cook also used the Cape Town stop to gather information about southern waters from experienced sailors. Dutch navigators had ventured farther south than most, and their accounts described conditions that challenged credibility. They spoke of icebergs larger than islands, seas that froze solid within hours, and winds so violent they could strip sails from rigging. Some claimed to have seen land beyond the ice, but none had managed to reach it. More disturbing were reports of ships that had attempted southern exploration and never returned. The Virgule de Drech had vanished in 1697 while seeking southern lands. The French vessel Saint Louis had disappeared in 1671 after reporting massive ice fields. Cook understood that he was attempting something that had defeated or destroyed every previous expedition, but the challenge only increased his determination. On November 22, 1772, the two ships sailed from Cape Town toward the Southern Ocean. Within days, they encountered conditions unlike anything Cook had experienced in tropical Pacific waters. The temperature dropped precipitously as they sailed south, forcing crews to don heavy clothing that made shipboard work clumsy and dangerous. Winds increased in strength and unpredictability, requiring constant attention to sails and rigging. The first icebergs appeared on December 10th, floating mountains of blue-white ice that dwarfed the ships and demonstrated the ocean's power to create beauty and terror simultaneously. Cook had never seen anything comparable. These were not the small ice formations occasionally encountered in northern waters, but cathedral-sized masses that had broken away from Antarctic ice sheets and drifted north into shipping routes. Johann Forster recorded his first impressions of the ice with scientific precision mixed with awe. These floating islands present a spectacle both magnificent and terrifying. Their size defies comprehension. Some rise 200 feet above the water's surface and must extend far deeper below. They glow with an ethereal blue light that seems to emanate from within the ice itself. Yet their beauty cannot disguise their deadly nature. A collision with one of these monsters would crush our ships instantly. Navigating among icebergs required seamanship skills that no naval academy taught. Cook learned through careful observation and experimentation, discovering that ice often appeared solid blue from a distance but revealed dangerous cracks and overhangs at closer range. He developed techniques for judging whether passages between icebergs were wide enough for safe passage, and he trained lookouts to spot ice formations in fog or darkness. The psychological pressure on the crews was immense. Sailors accustomed to tropical navigation found themselves in a world that seemed designed to kill human beings. The constant cold numbed fingers and made routine tasks agonizing. Ice formed on rigging, requiring men to climb into the yards with axes to prevent the accumulation from becoming so heavy it would snap the masts. Sleep was difficult in cabins that never warmed above freezing. On December 17, 1772, Cook achieved what no navigator had accomplished before. He crossed the Antarctic Circle, sailing into latitudes where summer days lasted nearly 24 hours and the sun never climbed high above the horizon. The achievement was remarkable not just for its geographical significance but for the seamanship it required. Cook had brought wooden ships into waters that could freeze solid, maintaining navigation and crew discipline under conditions that had defeated every previous attempt. The landscape, if it could be called that, beyond the Antarctic Circle seemed alien to human experience. Vast ice fields stretched to every horizon, broken by channels of dark water that opened and closed without warning. The silence was profound when winds died, creating an atmosphere so still that the crews spoke in whispers, afraid that loud sounds might disturb forces beyond their understanding. When storms arose, the violence was apocalyptic. Winds that could drive ice fragments through oak planking and waves that froze into ice sculptures as they broke over the ship's bows. Yet Cook pressed southward, driven by the same methodical determination that had carried him from Yorkshire poverty to Pacific fame. He was convinced that somewhere beyond the ice lay either the great southern continent or the edge of a polar ice cap that would prove no such continent existed. Either discovery would be historically significant, but only by pushing to the absolute limits of navigation could he provide definitive answers to questions that had puzzled geographers for centuries. On January 17, 1773, at latitude 67 degrees 15 minutes south, Cook encountered an ice barrier that finally stopped his advance. The sea ahead was completely frozen, a solid wall of ice that extended beyond the horizon in every direction. No ship could penetrate this frozen wilderness, but Cook had sailed closer to the South Pole than any human had ever traveled. His achievement settled the question of Terra Australis definitively. No temperate southern continent existed. Any land beyond the ice barrier lay in polar regions too cold and remote to support significant human settlement. Cook's reaction to this discovery revealed the complexity of his character. The scientist in him felt satisfaction at solving a geographical mystery that had persisted since ancient times, but the explorer in him was frustrated by the barrier that prevented complete knowledge of the Earth's southern regions. He suspected that land lay beyond the ice, Antarctica, though he could not know its name. But proving its existence would require technology and techniques that did not yet exist. The return voyage from the ice barrier nearly ended in disaster when HMS Resolution and HMS Adventure became separated in a storm of unprecedented violence. For 3 days, Cook sailed through mountainous seas and driving snow, searching for his consort vessel while fighting to prevent his own ship from being crushed against icebergs that appeared without warning in the blizzard. When the storm finally cleared, Adventure was nowhere to be seen. Cook faced a command decision that tested his judgment and humanity. He could spend weeks searching for Adventure, risking both ships in dangerous waters, or he could assume that Captain Tobias Furneaux had survived the storm and continue with the expedition's secondary objectives. Cook chose compromise, sailing to a predetermined rendezvous point in New Zealand where the ships could reunite if Adventure had survived. The passage from Antarctic waters to New Zealand provided welcome relief from the extreme conditions of southern exploration. Temperatures rose, ice disappeared from the rigging, and crews could work without the constant threat of freezing to death. But the transition also brought new challenges as tropical diseases returned and the psychological stress of extreme exploration manifested in conflicts among officers and crew. Johan Forster proved particularly difficult during this period, complaining constantly about accommodations, criticizing Cook's decisions, and demanding special treatment for his scientific work. The German naturalist seemed unable to understand that survival took precedence over specimen collection when ships were fighting for their lives in ice-filled seas. Cook's patience with Forster's demands wore thin, creating tensions that would persist throughout the voyage. In March 1773, Resolution reached New Zealand's South Island and found Adventure anchored safely in Dusky Sound. The reunion was joyful. Both crews had feared the other ship was lost, but it also revealed how differently the two vessels had fared during their separation. Adventure had found excellent shelter and spent months in protected waters, while Resolution had continued pushing southward into increasingly dangerous conditions. The extended stay in Dusky Sound allowed Cook to explore New Zealand's interior more thoroughly than his first voyage had permitted. What he found astonished him: landscapes of pristine beauty that seemed untouched by human activity. Dense forests of trees, unlike any in Europe, stretched up mountainsides towards snow-capped peaks. Lakes of extraordinary clarity reflected skies so blue they hurt to look at directly. Waterfalls cascaded hundreds of feet down granite cliffs into pools where fish swam in water cold enough to numb human hands within minutes. Cook also encountered Maori groups he had not met during his first voyage, people who had developed adaptations to New Zealand's unique environment that impressed him with their ingenuity. They had learned to hunt seals and whales in rough waters, to preserve foods for long winters, and to construct shelters that provided warmth without consuming the extensive fuel supplies that European buildings required. But cultural misunderstandings continued to create tensions. The Maori practice of tapu, complex spiritual restrictions on certain places, objects, and activities, often conflicted with European needs for water, wood, and anchorage. Cook struggled to respect indigenous customs while meeting his expedition's practical requirements, a balance that became increasingly difficult as contact between cultures intensified. On June 7, 1773, the two ships sailed from New Zealand toward Tahiti, where Cook planned to rest his crews and complete astronomical observations begun during his first voyage. The passage revealed how much Pacific navigation had improved since his initial crossing. Where the Endeavour had groped through largely unknown waters, Resolution and Adventure followed courses plotted with scientific precision. Cook's charts had transformed the Pacific from an unknown ocean into a highway connecting known destinations. The return to Tahiti was triumphant. The Tahitians remembered Cook fondly from his first visit and welcomed him as a friend returning from distant travels. Chief Tutaha, now growing old but still dignified, hosted ceremonies that honored the explorer who had brought strange but beneficial gifts to their island. The reunion demonstrated that cross-cultural relationships could transcend the misunderstandings and conflicts that often characterized European indigenous contact. But Tahiti had changed during Cook's absence. Spanish expeditions had visited the island, establishing a brief mission and claiming the territory for the Spanish crown. French explorers had also stopped at Tahiti, leaving European diseases that had killed hundreds of inhabitants. The pristine paradise that Cook remembered from 1769 now bore the scars of sustained European contact. Joseph Banks's replacement, Johann Forster, observed these changes with a scholar's eye for cultural transformation. He documented how European tools had altered traditional crafts, how introduced diseases had disrupted population patterns, and how contact with multiple European nations had created political divisions among Tahitian chiefs. His observations provided some of the earliest systematic documentation of how exploration changed the peoples it encountered. The expedition's stay in Tahiti also revealed changes in Cook himself. The confident but humble naval officer of the first voyage had been replaced by a more imperious commander who demanded absolute obedience and showed less patience with subordinates who questioned his decisions. Success had given Cook a sense of his own infallibility that would prove dangerous in situations requiring diplomatic flexibility. From Tahiti, Cook embarked on the most systematic exploration of the Pacific that anyone had ever attempted. Instead of following random courses dictated by wind patterns or theoretical geography, he developed a methodical plan to visit every known island group and search systematically for lands that earlier navigators had glimpsed but never confirmed. The strategy required unprecedented navigation precision. Cook would sail specific courses for predetermined distances, taking observations at regular intervals to ensure that no significant land was overlooked. If earlier explorers had reported islands that Cook could not locate, he would prove definitively that such islands did not exist. By the voyage's end, he intended to have resolved every geographical uncertainty in the Pacific Ocean. This systematic approach led to discoveries that filled crucial gaps in Pacific geography. Cook found and named the Cook Islands, a scattered group of coral atolls whose inhabitants had developed remarkable sailing skills that allowed them to maintain contact across hundreds of miles of open water. He rediscovered Easter Island, proving its location accurately for the first time, and documenting the mysterious stone statues that demonstrated the island's inhabitants' sophisticated artistic capabilities. Most significantly, Cook discovered New Caledonia, a large island whose rich mineral resources would later make it strategically important to European colonial powers. The indigenous Kanak people received Cook's expedition with cautious hospitality, trading food and crafted goods for iron tools that would revolutionize their traditional technologies. Each new discovery required careful diplomacy as Cook attempted to establish friendly relations with peoples who had no previous experience with Europeans. His success rate was remarkable. Most encounters proceeded without serious violence, and several island groups provided assistance that proved crucial to the expedition's success. Cook's reputation as an explorer who treated indigenous peoples with relative respect began to spread among Pacific cultures, creating expectations that would complicate his final voyage. By October 1773, Cook had completed his systematic survey of known Pacific island groups and begun the second leg of his southern exploration. He intended to push even farther south than his first attempt, searching for any land that might exist between his previous discoveries and the permanent ice barrier that surrounded Antarctica. This second southern voyage proved even more challenging than the first. The ships encountered ice formations larger than any they had seen previously, tabular icebergs that stretched for miles and rose 300 feet above the water's surface. Navigation required constant vigilance, as ice conditions changed without warning, opening passages that could close within hours and creating leads that might guide ships toward open water or trap them in frozen cul-de-sacs. On January 30th, 1774, Cook achieved his greatest southern penetration, reaching latitude 71 degrees 10 minutes south, a record that would stand for nearly 50 years. From this position, less than 1,200 miles from the South Pole, he could see nothing but ice extending to the horizon in every direction. Any land that existed beyond this point lay buried under ice sheets of unimaginable thickness. Cook's description of this ultimate southern position captured both the achievement and its limitations. I had now made the circuit of the Southern Ocean in a high latitude and traversed it in such a manner as to leave not the least room for the possibility of there being a continent, unless near the pole and out of reach of navigation. The ice extended east and west far beyond the reach of our sight, while the southern half of the horizon was illuminated by rays of light which were reflected from the ice to a considerable height. The return from this record southern latitude marked the end of Cook's Antarctic exploration, but not the end of his second voyage's discoveries. The expedition still had months of exploration planned, including detailed surveys of Pacific islands that Cook had visited briefly or not at all during his previous voyages. The most significant of these subsequent discoveries would be the archipelago that Cook named the Sandwich Islands, known today as Hawaii, where his third voyage would end in tragedy and death. But as Resolution turned northward from the ice barriers of the Antarctic in February 1774, carrying Cook toward his appointment with destiny among the volcanic peaks of the Central Pacific, the explorer felt only the satisfaction of having solved one of geography's greatest mysteries. He had proven that Terra Australis Incognita was a fantasy, that no temperate southern continent existed to balance the known land masses of the Northern Hemisphere. He had pushed human exploration to its physical limits, sailing closer to the South Pole than anyone had imagined possible. He had systematically surveyed the Pacific Ocean, resolving geographical uncertainties that had puzzled navigators for centuries. Most importantly, he had demonstrated that scientific exploration could achieve results that casual discovery could never match. His methodical approach, precise instruments, and systematic documentation had transformed the Pacific from an unknown wilderness into a charted ocean where navigation could proceed with confidence. But success carried its own dangers. Cook's achievements had made him the most famous explorer of his generation, a man whose name was spoken with reverence in the courts of Europe and the councils of Pacific chiefs. Fame created expectations that would prove impossible to fulfill, and a sense of infallibility that would compromise his judgment when he needed it most. The boy from Yorkshire who had once mucked out stables was now an international celebrity, but celebrity would prove a more dangerous burden than poverty had ever been. The Resolution and Adventure arrived at Cape Town in March 1775, after 3 years of exploration that had rewritten the map of the Southern Hemisphere. Cook's second voyage had been even more successful than his first. He had circumnavigated the globe at high southern latitudes, discovered numerous Pacific islands, and definitively disproven the existence of Terra Australis Incognita. Yet as the two ships anchored in Table Bay, Cook felt not satisfaction, but a restless hunger for greater challenges. The transformation in Cook's character was evident to everyone who knew him. The methodical, humble naval officer who had departed England in 1772 had been replaced by a man intoxicated with his own achievements. Cook now spoke with the absolute certainty of someone who had never been proven wrong, who had solved every geographical puzzle he had encountered, who had sailed farther and discovered more than any explorer in history. This confidence, justified by unprecedented success, would ultimately prove fatal. At Cape Town, Cook encountered French navigator Marion Dufresne, the rival explorer who had been searching for southern lands while Cook explored Antarctic waters. Dufresne's expedition had ended in disaster. The French commander and 26 of his men had been killed by Maori warriors in New Zealand's Bay of Islands. The news sobered Cook temporarily, reminding him that exploration remained dangerous despite his own remarkable run of success. But the tragedy also reinforced Cook's belief in his superior judgment and diplomatic skills. Where the French had blundered into fatal conflict with indigenous peoples, Cook had maintained generally peaceful relations throughout the Pacific. His reputation for fair dealing with native populations had spread among island cultures, creating expectations of respectful treatment that Cook believed he could always fulfill. The voyage home to England revealed how completely Cook's discoveries had transformed European understanding of the Pacific. The ocean that had once been labeled unknown sea on maps was now crisscrossed with shipping routes connecting charted islands. Cook's systematic surveys had provided navigational information so precise that merchant vessels could trade safely in waters where exploration had once been a desperate gamble against unknown dangers. HMS Resolution dropped anchor at Spithead on July 30, 1775, completing a voyage of 3 years and 18 days during which Cook had logged over 60,000 nautical miles. The statistics were staggering. He had sailed the equivalent of circumnavigating the globe more than twice while pushing into higher latitudes than any previous explorer. More remarkably, he had lost only 4 men to disease during the entire voyage, demonstrating that his innovations in shipboard health could sustain crews through the longest expeditions. The reception that greeted Cook's return surpassed even the acclaim that had followed his first voyage. King George III immediately granted him an audience that lasted over 3 hours, during which Cook presented charts that revealed coastlines stretching across half the globe. The Royal Society voted him the Copley Medal, their highest honor, for achievements that had advanced natural knowledge more than any explorer in memory. Cook was promoted to post captain, a rank that guaranteed him financial security for life and offered a comfortable position at the Royal Hospital for Seamen in Greenwich. The appointment would allow him to retire from active service while maintaining his naval rank and salary. At 47, Cook could look forward to decades of comfortable retirement, writing his memoirs and enjoying the respect that his achievements had earned. But retirement held no appeal for a man whose greatest satisfaction came from sailing into unknown waters. Cook accepted the Greenwich appointment reluctantly, understanding that it represented the pinnacle of professional success while knowing that it would confine him to a life of administrative tedium. Within months, he was chafing against the constraints of shore duty, longing for the quarterdeck of a ship bound for distant seas. The opportunity for one final voyage emerged from an unlikely source: the search for the Northwest Passage, a hypothetical sea route connecting the Pacific and Atlantic Oceans through the Arctic waters above North America. For 3 centuries, explorers had sought this passage from the Atlantic side, probing into Hudson Bay and the labyrinthine channels of the Canadian Arctic without success. Cook proposed a revolutionary approach. He would search for the passage from the Pacific side, sailing north from known waters toward the unexplored Arctic Ocean. The strategic implications were enormous. Any nation that controlled the Northwest Passage would possess a shipping route that could revolutionize global trade, connecting Europe and Asia without the long voyage around Africa's Cape of Good Hope. The passage would also provide military advantages, allowing naval forces to move between oceans without the delays and vulnerabilities of current routes. The Admiralty authorized Cook's 3rd voyage with enthusiasm that bordered on desperation. American colonial rebellion was straining British resources, French competition threatened British trade routes, and Spanish expansion in the Pacific challenged Britain's growing influence in that ocean. Discovery of the Northwest Passage could provide strategic advantages that would secure British dominance for generations. The expedition would follow a carefully planned route: sail to the Pacific via Cape Horn, explore the North American coast from California to Alaska, then push into the Arctic Ocean until ice barriers halted progress or the passage was found. If successful, Cook would have connected all the world's oceans into a single navigational system, completing the work of global exploration that he had begun a decade earlier. 2 ships were prepared for this ambitious undertaking. HMS Resolution, Cook's trusted flagship from the second voyage, underwent extensive modifications to strengthen her for potential Arctic conditions. HMS Discovery, a newer vessel of 298 tons, was assigned as consort under the command of Captain Charles Clerke, one of Cook's most experienced officers. The scientific objectives of the third voyage were less extensive than those of Cook's previous expeditions, reflecting the Admiralty's focus on practical geographical discovery rather than pure research. No major naturalists accompanied the expedition, though artist John Webber was assigned to create visual records of any lands discovered. The voyage's primary goal was strategic rather than scientific, finding a passage that could reshape global commerce and naval power. Cook's preparations revealed a man transformed by fame and success. Where he had once supervised every detail personally, he now delegated extensively to subordinates while focusing on grand strategy rather than practical concerns. His interactions with crew members became more distant and authoritarian, reflecting his evolution from working-class naval officer to international celebrity. The crew noticed these changes with concern. Cook's previous voyages had been characterized by unusual cooperation between officers and men, based on shared respect for their commander's competence and fairness. The cook preparing for the third voyage seemed less approachable, more conscious of his elevated status, and less willing to tolerate questioning of his decisions. On July 12, 1776, HMS Resolution and HMS Discovery sailed from Plymouth carrying Cook toward his final destiny in the Pacific. The departure was witnessed by crowds that understood they were seeing off the greatest explorer of the age, though few suspected they were watching him leave England for the last time. The passage to Cape Town proceeded smoothly, demonstrating Cook's continued mastery of navigation and ship handling. His logs reveal a commander still capable of inspired seamanship, maintaining precise courses through Atlantic storms and arriving at designated ports exactly when planned. Whatever changes fame had wrought in Cook's character, it had not diminished his professional competence. At Cape Town, Cook received disturbing intelligence about the American colonial rebellion that had erupted during his preparations for departure. British forces were struggling against colonial armies that seemed to multiply with each defeat. French support for the rebels threatened to transform a colonial uprising into a global war that would strain British resources to their limits. The news added urgency to Cook's mission. Discovery of the Northwest Passage could provide Britain with strategic advantages that might prove decisive in the expanding conflict. Success would also cement Cook's legacy as the explorer who had solved geography's greatest remaining puzzle, ensuring his place in history regardless of political upheavals. From Cape Town, the expedition sailed into the Indian Ocean toward New Zealand and the Pacific Islands that Cook knew better than any European. The voyage revealed how completely Cook's previous discoveries had transformed Pacific navigation. Where the Endeavour had groped through largely unknown waters in 1769, Resolution and Discovery followed established routes connecting charted destinations. The ships reached New Zealand in February 1777, anchoring in Ship Cove, where Cook had sheltered during both previous voyages. The Maori reception was notably cooler than before, reflecting growing resistance to European presence and the violent conflicts that had occurred since Cook's last visit. The friendly relationships that had characterized early contact were giving way to mutual suspicion as cultural differences proved irreconcilable. Cook's reaction to this changing reception revealed his growing inflexibility. Rather than adapting his approach to accommodate Maori concerns, he insisted on the same privileges and assistance that had been freely granted during his earlier visits. When local chiefs proved reluctant to provide supplies or labor, Cook responded with barely concealed irritation that surprised officers who remembered his previous diplomatic skills. The expedition's naturalist, William Anderson, recorded his observations of this deteriorating relationship with concern. The natives appear less willing to accommodate our needs than during the captain's previous visits. Their manner suggests suspicion rather than hostility, but the easy cooperation of earlier years has clearly ended. Captain Cook seems frustrated by this change, though he has not yet acknowledged that circumstances require different approaches. Despite these tensions, the New Zealand stopover accomplished its practical objectives. The ships were re-provisioned, their hulls cleaned and repaired, and their crews rested after the long passage from Cape Town. Cook also used the time to drill his officers in Arctic navigation techniques, preparing them for conditions they would encounter in northern waters. On February 25, 1777, the expedition sailed from New Zealand toward Tahiti, following the route that Cook had pioneered 8 years earlier. The passage revealed his continued excellence as a navigator despite deteriorating weather and contrary winds. He reached Tahitian waters exactly when his calculations predicted, demonstrating the precision that had made him famous. The return to Tahiti provided a final glimpse of the diplomat and explorer who had won hearts throughout the Pacific during his earlier voyages. The Tahitians welcomed Cook with genuine affection, organizing ceremonies that honored his previous kindness and celebrating his return as the homecoming of a beloved friend. Chief Tu, who had succeeded the deceased Tutaha, presented Cook with traditional gifts and offered assistance for his expedition's needs. Cook responded to this warm reception with the charm and respect that had characterized his finest moments as a cultural ambassador. He participated in Tahitian ceremonies with dignity, exchanged gifts according to local customs, and took genuine interest in changes that had occurred since his last visit. For several weeks, the imperious celebrity vanished, replaced by the thoughtful explorer who had first earned Pacific people's trust and admiration. The Tahitian interlude also demonstrated how Cook's previous voyages had changed Pacific Island societies. European tools had revolutionized traditional crafts, while introduced plants and animals were altering agricultural practices. Most significantly, contact with multiple European expeditions had created political divisions, as different chiefs aligned themselves with various foreign powers. Cook observed these changes with mixed feelings. As a scientist, he was fascinated by cultural transformation occurring at unprecedented speed. As a humanist, he was troubled by the unintended consequences of exploration that he had initiated. His journals from this period reveal a man beginning to grapple with the moral complexities of his achievements. From Tahiti, Cook sailed north toward regions of the Pacific that he had never explored, the vast oceanic wilderness between French Polynesia and the North American coast. This passage would test his navigation skills against challenges that surpassed even his Antarctic explorations, as he attempted to locate islands that earlier Spanish navigators had glimpsed but never accurately charted. On January 18, 1778, Cook achieved what would prove to be his final great discovery, the Hawaiian Islands, which he named the Sandwich Islands in honor of his patron, the Earl of Sandwich. Rising from the Pacific's blue immensity, the islands appeared like a vision of paradise, their volcanic peaks crowned with clouds and their shores fringed with palm trees and white beaches. The Hawaiian discovery was serendipitous rather than planned. Cook was sailing toward the North American coast when his lookout spotted land in a region where no European charts showed islands. The sighting demonstrated both Cook's extraordinary luck and his systematic approach to exploration. He had been following courses designed to leave no significant areas of ocean unexplored, and his thoroughness had been rewarded with one of the Pacific's greatest discoveries. The Hawaiians who paddled out to meet Cook's ships presented him with perhaps the most complex cultural challenge of his career. These were sophisticated people who had developed a civilization of remarkable artistic and political achievement in complete isolation from European influence. Their society included powerful chiefs, skilled craftspeople, and religious specialists who maintained elaborate spiritual traditions connecting them to their volcanic landscape. More significantly, the Hawaiians possessed a religious calendar that seemed to identify Cook's arrival with the return of Lono, one of their most important deities. The timing was extraordinary. Cook had arrived during Makahiki, the season when Lono was believed to visit the islands bringing peace, fertility, and abundance. The white sails of Cook's ships resembled the symbols associated with Lono, and Cook himself seemed to fulfill prophecies about the god's return. The reception that greeted Cook at Hawaii surpassed even Tahiti's enthusiastic welcome. Thousands of Hawaiians lined the shores, chanting, drumming, and performing ceremonies that honored divine visitors. Chiefs prostrated themselves before Cook. Offerings of food and precious goods were heaped at his feet, and religious specialists conducted rituals that clearly identified him with supernatural powers. Cook's reaction to this divine reception revealed both his strengths and his fatal weaknesses as a cultural ambassador. Initially, he handled the situation with characteristic diplomatic skill, participating respectfully in ceremonies while avoiding actions that might reinforce religious misunderstandings. He accepted offerings graciously, allowed Hawaiian religious specialists to conduct their rituals, and maintained the dignified bearing that reinforced his apparent divine status. But success in managing this delicate situation required humility that Cook no longer possessed. The man who had been celebrated in European courts as the greatest explorer of his age found it easy to accept treatment as a Polynesian deity. The adulation fed his growing sense of infallibility, creating dangerous overconfidence that would prove fatal when circumstances changed. The expedition's stay in Hawaii was initially triumphant. The ships were re-provisioned with fresh food that restored the crew's health after months at sea. Hawaiian craftspeople demonstrated artistic techniques that amazed European observers, while their navigational knowledge provided insights into Pacific geography that complemented Cook's scientific surveys. William Anderson documented Hawaiian society with scholarly precision, creating some of the earliest detailed records of Polynesian civilization. His observations revealed a culture of extraordinary sophistication, complex political structures, advanced agricultural techniques, and religious beliefs that connected human society intimately with natural forces. The Hawaiians possessed technologies for working stone, wood, and fiber that produced results European craftsmen could barely match with metal tools. Most remarkably, the Hawaiians had developed navigation techniques that allowed them to cross thousands of miles of open ocean in double-hulled canoes, maintaining contact between island groups scattered across distances that challenged European vessels. Their knowledge of wave patterns, stellar positions, and weather signs represented accumulated wisdom that complemented Cook's mathematical approach to navigation. After 2 weeks of unprecedented hospitality, Cook reluctantly departed Hawaii to continue his primary mission: the search for the Northwest Passage along North America's western coast. The farewell was emotional on both sides, with Hawaiian crowds gathering to sing traditional departure songs while Cook's crews waved from the ship's rigging. Many participants seemed to understand instinctively that this parting held special significance. The voyage north toward the American coast revealed Cook at his professional best, navigating through weather conditions that challenged even his extraordinary skills. Pacific storms battered the ships, with winds that stripped sails and seas that swept men overboard. Ice began forming on rigging as they sailed into higher latitudes, requiring constant vigilance to prevent dangerous accumulations. On March 7, 1778, Cook sighted the North American coast at what is now Oregon, beginning a survey that would add thousands of miles of previously unknown coastline to European maps. The work required the same methodical precision that had characterized his Pacific explorations, but under conditions that made every observation a struggle against hostile elements. The North American coast presented challenges that surpassed even Antarctic exploration in their demands on seamanship and endurance. Constant storms, treacherous currents, and rocky shores that appeared without warning created navigation hazards that claimed vessels regularly. Cook's ability to survey accurately under these conditions demonstrated the peak of his professional competence. The indigenous peoples of the North American coast, Chinook, Nootka, and other tribes, received Cook's expedition with cautious hospitality that reflected their experience with earlier European visitors. These were not isolated island populations encountering Europeans for the first time, but sophisticated societies that had developed trading relationships with Russian and Spanish expeditions. Cook's interactions with North American peoples revealed his continued skill as a cultural diplomat when his pride was not engaged. He established trading relationships that benefited both sides, learned indigenous names for geographical features, and gathered information about regional geography that proved crucial to his survey work. These encounters demonstrated that Cook retained the diplomatic abilities that had made him successful, even as fame had made him less willing to exercise them. The survey of the North American coast proceeded northward through the Inside Passage, the protected waterway behind coastal islands that Spanish navigators had discovered but never explored thoroughly. Cook's charts of this region remained standard references for over a century, demonstrating his continued excellence as a maritime surveyor despite the personal changes that fame had wrought. By July 1778, Cook had reached Alaska and begun exploring the Arctic Ocean, searching for the eastern entrance to the Northwest Passage that had eluded explorers for 3 centuries. The work required navigation skills that pushed beyond the limits of contemporary knowledge, as Cook attempted to chart waters where ice conditions changed daily and conventional landmarks did not exist. The Arctic exploration revealed Cook's unchanged brilliance as an explorer facing ultimate challenges. Despite deteriorating ice conditions that threatened to trap his ships permanently, he pushed northward until further progress became impossible. His farthest north, latitude 70 degrees 44 minutes, established a record that would stand for decades while proving definitively that the Northwest Passage, if it existed, lay beyond the reach of contemporary navigation technology. The return south from Alaska in late 1778 should have been triumphant. Cook had surveyed thousands of miles of previously unknown coastline, established that the Northwest Passage was impractical for regular navigation, and added significantly to European knowledge of North American geography. His third voyage had achieved every reasonable objective while maintaining the high standards of accuracy and seamanship that had made him famous. But Cook was no longer capable of accepting reasonable limits to his achievements. The man who had solved every geographical puzzle he had encountered could not accept that the Northwest Passage might be beyond his reach. Against the advice of his officers and contrary to his original orders, Cook decided to return to Hawaii for the winter before making another attempt at Arctic exploration the following summer. This decision to revisit a place where he had been treated as a god, where success had been effortless and complete, would prove fatal. Cook was sailing toward an encounter with the tragic limitations of his own transformed character, returning to a paradise where divine status could not be maintained indefinitely and where the consequences of losing face could be deadly. As Resolution and Discovery sailed south from Alaska in October 1778, carrying Cook toward his final confrontation with the gods and chiefs of Hawaii, the greatest explorer of his age was approaching the moment when his extraordinary luck would finally run out. The farm boy who had risen to international fame through methodical competence and diplomatic skill was about to discover that some challenges could not be solved through superior navigation or force of will. The ships that approached Hawaii in January 1779 carried a man transformed by a decade of unprecedented success into someone his original crew would barely recognize. Cook's final voyage to the islands where he would die had become inevitable the moment he decided that being treated as a mortal explorer was insufficient for someone of his achievements. The tragedy that awaited him on the black volcanic shores of Kealakekua Bay was already written in the overweening pride that success had bred in a man who had once known the humility of Yorkshire poverty and North Sea storms. The islands that emerged from the Pacific horizon in January 1779 looked identical to the paradise Cook had departed 11 months earlier, but everything had changed. The Hawaii that welcomed him as Lono in 1778 had been a society in perfect ritual balance, celebrating the season when their god brought peace and abundance. The Hawaii that watched his ships approach in early 1779 was deep into a different phase of the religious calendar, a time when Lono was supposed to have departed, yielding authority to Ku, the god of war and earthly power. Cook could not have known that his return violated fundamental principles of Hawaiian cosmology. In Polynesian belief systems, divine beings followed predictable patterns that maintained cosmic order. Lono visited during Makahiki, brought fertility and peace, then departed to allow the resumption of normal human activities. Gods who failed to follow these patterns became dangerous. Their presence a sign that the natural order was breaking down. The Hawaiian chiefs, who had prostrated themselves before Cook in 1778, now faced an impossible situation. If Cook truly was Lono, his unexpected return suggested divine displeasure with their stewardship of the islands. If he was merely human, a possibility that his return during the wrong season made more likely, then they had been humiliated by offering divine honors to a mortal foreign visitor. Either interpretation demanded a response that would restore proper relationships between gods, chiefs, and people. The immediate reception seemed similar to Cook's first arrival. Thousands of Hawaiians gathered on the shores of Kealakekua Bay, chanting and performing ceremonies as the familiar ships dropped anchor in the protected waters. But experienced observers noticed crucial differences. The ceremonies were shorter and less elaborate. The offerings were smaller and presented with less enthusiasm. Most significantly, the great chiefs who had competed for Cook's attention in 1778 were notably absent from the initial welcoming rituals. Cook himself was oblivious to these subtle signs of changing Hawaiian attitudes. His journals from this period reveal a man so accustomed to adulation that he could not conceive of circumstances where his presence might be unwelcome. He expected the same divine treatment that had been accorded him previously, and when it was not immediately forthcoming, he attributed the difference to temporary Hawaiian concerns rather than fundamental changes in their relationship. The expedition's artist John Weber was more perceptive than his commander. His sketches from this period capture Hawaiian faces marked by uncertainty and tension rather than the joy that had characterized his earlier portraits. "The natives appear troubled," he wrote in his journal. "They conduct the ceremonies required by custom, but their manner suggests obligation rather than celebration. Something has changed in their attitude toward us, though I cannot identify what." The first serious incident occurred on February 4th, when Hawaiian warriors attempted to steal one of Discovery's boats. The theft itself was not unprecedented. Pacific Islanders had always been fascinated by European technology, and attempts to acquire metal goods had occurred throughout Cook's voyages. But the Hawaiian approach to this theft was different, marked by organized planning and open defiance rather than opportunistic pilfering. Cook's reaction revealed how completely fame had altered his judgment. Instead of treating the incident as a cultural misunderstanding requiring diplomatic resolution, he responded with immediate force. Marines were landed with orders to recover the boat and arrest the thieves. When Hawaiian chiefs protested this violation of their territorial authority, Cook dismissed their objections with an arrogance that astonished his own officers. Charles Clerk, captain of the Discovery, privately questioned Cook's handling of the situation. "The captain's manner toward the natives has changed remarkably since our previous visit," he confided to his journal. "He demands compliance with his wishes as though divine status grants him temporal authority over these people. This approach may succeed in the short term, but it stores up troubles that could prove serious if circumstances turn against us." The stolen boat was recovered without bloodshed, but the incident had demonstrated to Hawaiian observers that Cook was willing to use force to impose his will. More significantly, it showed that he could be defied, that whatever divine powers he might possess, they did not prevent Hawaiian warriors from challenging his authority. The seeds of larger conflict had been planted in ground made fertile by cultural misunderstanding and wounded pride on both sides. For nearly 2 weeks, the expedition continued its work despite underlying tensions. The ships were re-provisioned, their hulls cleaned and repaired, and scientific observations continued. Cook completed his survey of the bay, adding detailed charts of Hawaiian waters to the geographical knowledge that his voyages had accumulated. On the surface, the visit proceeded successfully, but beneath this appearance of normalcy, both sides were reassessing their relationship. Hawaiian chiefs debated whether Cook's return signified divine approval or cosmic disruption. Cook's officers worried about their commander's increasingly inflexible attitude toward people who had once been allies. The Hawaiians gathered in increasing numbers around the bay, their presence creating an atmosphere of watchful tension rather than celebratory welcome. On February 11th, Cook made the decision that sealed his fate. Despite adequate supplies and favorable weather for departure, he chose to extend his stay in Hawaii to complete what he deemed essential observations. The decision reflected his perfectionist approach to exploration, his refusal to leave any task incomplete. But it also demonstrated his inability to recognize that some situations required retreat rather than persistence. The reaction to Cook's decision to prolong his visit was immediately negative. Hawaiian crowds that had gathered to bid farewell grew restless when informed that the ships would remain. Chiefs who had prepared elaborate departure ceremonies found themselves in the awkward position of hosting guests who had overstayed their welcome. Most ominously, priests responsible for maintaining ritual balance began discussing whether divine visitors who refused to depart at the proper time might actually be dangerous spirits requiring forcible expulsion. William Anderson, the expedition's naturalist, observed these changing dynamics with growing concern. The natives' manner has shifted from respectful attention to barely concealed impatience, he wrote. They perform their duties toward us with mechanical precision, but their hearts are clearly elsewhere. Captain Cook seems oblivious to this change, or perhaps he believes his reputation gives him the right to ignore native preferences. The crisis that would culminate in Cook's death began with another theft, this time more serious than the previous incident. On the night of February 13th, Hawaiian warriors launched a coordinated attack on Discovery, attempting to steal the ship's large cutter. The boat was essential for communication between ships and shore. Its loss would have severely compromised the expedition's operations. The theft attempt was thwarted by vigilant sentries, but not before revealing the level of organization behind Hawaiian resistance. This was not random pilfering by individual opportunists, but a planned operation involving multiple canoes, coordinated timing, and detailed knowledge of European security procedures. The Hawaiians had been watching, learning, and preparing for confrontation. Cook's reaction was swift and decisive. He would implement the strategy that had succeeded in similar situations throughout the Pacific, taking a high-ranking chief hostage until the stolen property was returned. The approach had worked effectively in Tahiti, New Zealand, and other island groups where Cook's reputation and superior firepower had persuaded local leaders to cooperate rather than risk escalation. But Hawaii in February 1779 was not Tahiti in 1769. The Hawaiians were not isolated islanders encountering European technology for the first time. They had observed Cook's methods for over a year, analyzed his strengths and weaknesses, and concluded that his power, while considerable, was not unlimited. Most crucially, they had begun to doubt whether he truly possessed the divine authority that his initial reception had attributed to him. On the morning of February 14, 1779, St. Valentine's Day in the European calendar, though such Christian associations meant nothing to the Hawaiian warriors preparing for battle, Cook made his final fatal decision. He would go ashore personally to arrest Kalaniʻopuʻu, the elderly paramount chief of the island's southern district. The chief would be held aboard Resolution until the stolen cutter was returned and the thieves were punished. The plan that Cook outlined to his officers was identical to procedures he had followed successfully throughout his career. A small party of Marines would accompany him ashore, providing visible but not overwhelming force. The chief would be invited aboard the ship for negotiations, then informed that he was effectively a prisoner until Cook's demands were met. Previous experience suggested that indigenous leaders faced with European technological superiority would choose compromise over confrontation. But Cook's officers harbored doubts that their commander refused to acknowledge. Lieutenant James King, who had replaced the recently deceased William Anderson as the expedition's senior scientist, privately questioned whether the strategy would work with Hawaiians who had already demonstrated their willingness to challenge European authority. "The natives appear more confident than any we have encountered," he wrote. "They show little fear of our weapons and seem prepared for conflict rather than cowed by our presence." Charles Clerk was more direct in his concerns. When Cook outlined his plan to arrest Kalaniʻopuʻu, Clerk suggested that a show of force might be sufficient, that anchoring the ships closer to shore with guns trained on the village might persuade the Hawaiians to return the cutter without the risks inherent in going ashore. Cook dismissed this suggestion with an irritation that revealed how completely he had lost the diplomatic flexibility that had once been his greatest strength. At sunrise on February 14th, Cook prepared for what he intended to be a routine demonstration of European authority. He dressed carefully in his full dress uniform, blue coat with gold braid, white breeches, sword at his side, presenting the image of imperial power that had impressed indigenous peoples throughout the Pacific. 9 Marines accompanied him, their red coats and shouldered muskets providing visible evidence of European military superiority. The boat that carried Cook toward the beach at Kealakekua Bay contained the seeds of tragedy that 11 years of exploration had sown. The success that had made Cook famous had bred an overconfidence that blinded him to changing circumstances. The reputation that opened doors throughout the Pacific had convinced him that his will was sufficient to overcome any resistance. The divine status that Hawaiians had initially granted him had become, in his mind, a permanent authority that no mortal challenge could diminish. The beach scene that awaited Cook resembled a theater prepared for drama. Several thousand Hawaiians had gathered in the pre-dawn darkness, their numbers far exceeding any crowd that had assembled during his first visit. Warriors stood in formation, their spears and clubs held ready, while chiefs conferred in urgent whispers about how to respond to Cook's arrival. The atmosphere was electric with tension that even European observers could feel. Kalaniʻopuʻu himself sat calmly in the center of this gathering, an elderly man whose dignified bearing had impressed Cook during their earlier meetings. The paramount chief was awake and dressed as though he had been expecting this confrontation, his feathered cloak and carved staff symbols of authority that he was prepared to defend. At 70 years old, Kalaniʻopuʻu had ruled through decades of warfare and diplomacy that had taught him when to yield and when to resist. Cook approached the chief with the confidence of a man accustomed to having his will obeyed. Speaking through interpreters, he explained that the chief must accompany him aboard Resolution until the stolen cutter was returned. The request was phrased politely, but the Marine's presence made clear that refusal was not an option. Cook expected the same compliance that had characterized his previous interactions with Pacific leaders. Kalaniʻopuʻu's initial response suggested that Cook's strategy might succeed. The elderly chief listened to the translator's explanation with apparent calm, asked a few questions about the arrangements for his stay aboard the ship, and seemed prepared to comply with Cook's demands. Several of his advisors nodded agreement, indicating that the paramount chief's cooperation would have their support. But as Kalaniʻopuʻu rose to accompany Cook toward the boats, other voices began to be heard. Warriors who had not been consulted about their chief's surrender stepped forward with protests. Women from Kalaniʻopuʻu's family rushed from nearby houses, weeping and pleading with him not to go with the foreigners. Most significantly, younger chiefs who had opposed accommodation with the Europeans began arguing that their paramount chief was being deceived by visitors whose intentions were hostile. The crowd's mood shifted with frightening speed. The respectful attention that had greeted Cook's arrival dissolved into angry murmurs and hostile gestures. Warriors who had stood at respectful distances began pressing closer, their weapons no longer held carelessly, but gripped with obvious intent. The theatrical atmosphere became genuinely dangerous as thousands of Hawaiians began to believe that their paramount chief was about to be kidnapped by foreign invaders. Cook found himself in a situation that his previous experience had not prepared him to handle. Throughout his career, he had dealt with indigenous leaders who possessed absolute authority over their followers. A chief's word was law, and compliance by subordinates was automatic. But Hawaiian society was more complex, with power distributed among multiple chiefs, family groups, and warrior societies that could challenge paramount authority when they believed fundamental interests were threatened. Kalaniʻopuʻu himself began to waver as pressure from his people mounted. The old chief had initially been willing to cooperate, but he could see that accompanying Cook would be interpreted by his followers as cowardice or betrayal. His authority depended on maintaining the respect of warriors who were now demanding that he resist foreign demands. Caught between Cook's insistence and his people's opposition, Kalaniʻopuʻu found himself paralyzed by conflicting pressures. The crisis deepened when news arrived from the bay that Hawaiian warriors had killed a chief who had been cooperating with the Europeans. The dead man had been trying to prevent the theft of Discovery's cutter when he was struck down by warriors who considered his assistance to the foreigners an act of treason. The news electrified the crowd around Cook, transforming anger into rage and making clear that blood had already been shed in this confrontation. Cook's Marines sensed the changing atmosphere with the instincts of professional soldiers. Sergeant John Edgecombe, a veteran of multiple campaigns who had served with Cook throughout the second voyage, moved closer to his commander and suggested quietly that they should return to the boats immediately. The crowd was becoming too large and too hostile for 9 men to control, regardless of their superior weapons. But Cook refused to retreat. The man who had never failed in similar situations could not accept that this confrontation might be different. He continued pressing Kalaniʻōpuʻu to accompany him, seemingly oblivious to the thousands of increasingly agitated Hawaiians surrounding them. His reputation for infallibility had become a prison that prevented him from recognizing when tactical withdrawal was the only rational option. The fatal moment arrived when a young Hawaiian warrior, inflamed by news of the chief's death and convinced that Cook intended to kidnap their paramount leader, raised his spear and advanced directly toward the Europeans. Cook, finally recognizing that the situation had become dangerous, drew his sword and ordered the Marines to prepare to fire. The theatrical confrontation was about to become a deadly battle. What followed occurred with the terrible speed of violence that transforms situations irreversibly within seconds. Cook fired his pistol at the advancing warrior, but the weapon contained only small shot that wounded without killing. The Hawaiian staggered but did not fall, and his survival seemed to prove to the watching crowd that Cook's supernatural powers were limited. A god's weapon would have killed instantly. A mortal's might only wound. The psychological moment when Cook's divinity died was visible to every Hawaiian present. The man they had worshipped as Lono, who had seemed to command forces beyond human understanding, had revealed himself to be merely another armed foreigner whose weapons, while dangerous, were not omnipotent. The revelation released emotions that had been building for weeks. Resentment at foreign presumption, anger at being deceived, and determination to defend their chief and their island. The Marines fired a volley that killed several Hawaiians and temporarily halted their advance. But the sound of muskets only confirmed that Cook possessed superior technology rather than divine power. In the few seconds required for reloading, hundreds of warriors surged forward with spears, clubs, and daggers that could kill Europeans as easily as any other mortals. Cook turned toward the boats, finally recognizing that retreat was essential, but the movement came too late. A Hawaiian warrior struck him from behind with a club that sent him stumbling toward the water's edge. As he fell, other warriors closed in with weapons that had been blessed by priests and sharpened for war. The greatest explorer in human history had perhaps 30 seconds left to live. The final moments of James Cook's life were witnessed by his Marines, who were fighting desperately to reach their boats while providing covering fire for their commander's retreat. What they saw would haunt their dreams for the remainder of their lives. A man who had sailed farther than anyone in history, who had solved mysteries that had puzzled humanity for millennia, being overwhelmed by warriors whose ancestors had never seen European faces, until Cook brought them into contact with the wider world. Cook fell face first into the shallow water of Kealakekua Bay, his blood mixing with Pacific surf as warriors continued striking his body with clubs and daggers. The hands that had held chronometers and sextants that had drawn charts used by navigators throughout the world clutched frantically at volcanic sand before losing their grip on life forever. At 8:17 on the morning of February 14, 1779, James Cook died in water that reflected the morning sky, another casualty of the violent collision between worlds that his own voyages had made inevitable. The battle continued for several more minutes as Cook's Marines fought their way to their boats under covering fire from the ships. 4 other Europeans died alongside their commander, while Hawaiian casualties numbered in the dozens, but the strategic outcome was already decided. Cook was dead, his body in Hawaiian hands, and his expedition faced the immediate problem of recovering from a disaster that no one had anticipated. The reaction aboard Resolution and Discovery was initially one of shocked disbelief. Cook had seemed invulnerable, protected by reputation, superior technology, and a lifetime of successful encounters with indigenous peoples. His officers had witnessed him overcome every challenge that exploration could present, from Antarctic ice to Pacific storms to diplomatic crises that had defeated lesser commanders. The idea that he could be killed by Stone Age weapons wielded by people who had recently worshipped him seemed impossible. Charles Clerke, now in command of the expedition, faced immediate decisions that would determine whether Cook's death marked the beginning or the end of the disaster. The ship's guns could devastate the Hawaiian villages around Kealakekua Bay, but such retaliation would accomplish nothing except satisfying desires for revenge. The expedition's primary mission, finding the Northwest Passage, remained incomplete, and Clerke had to decide whether to continue Cook's work or abandon it in favor of immediate return to England. More immediately, Clerke needed to recover Cook's body for proper burial. The prospect of leaving their commander's remains in Hawaiian hands was unacceptable to crews who had followed him across 3 oceans and through dangers that had tested human endurance to its limits. But negotiations for the body's return would require diplomatic skills that none of Cook's subordinates possessed to the same degree as their dead commander. The Hawaiians themselves were divided about how to respond to Cook's death. Some viewed it as necessary defense of their chief and their island against foreign aggression. Others worried that killing someone they had previously treated as divine might bring supernatural retribution. The practical question of what to do with Cook's body became entangled with religious concerns about proper treatment of someone who might have been a god. Hawaiian religious specialists ultimately decided that Cook's body required ritual treatment that would neutralize any supernatural powers it might retain, while demonstrating proper respect for his achievements. The corpse was subjected to ceremonies normally reserved for the highest-ranking chiefs, with the flesh removed from the bones and the remains prepared according to traditional practices. The process took several days, during which tensions around Kealakekua Bay remained explosive. Negotiations for the return of Cook's remains revealed the diplomatic challenges that his death had created. The Hawaiians were willing to return the bones as a gesture of respect, but they demanded assurances that the British would not seek revenge for their commander's death. Clerke faced the delicate task of projecting strength sufficient to ensure his expedition's safety while avoiding provocations that might trigger further violence. The eventual return of Cook's bones was accomplished through the mediation of Hawaiian priests who had maintained friendly relations with the expedition's naturalists. On February 20th, 6 days after Cook's death, a solemn procession of Hawaiians approached the ships carrying a bundle wrapped in traditional tapa cloth. The remains were incomplete. Some bones had been kept as religious relics, but they included enough to provide the burial that Cook's crews demanded. The funeral service for James Cook was conducted on February 21, 1779, in Kealakekua Bay, where he had died a week earlier. Clerke read the Anglican burial service while Marines fired the volleys traditionally accorded to officers of Cook's rank. The Hawaiian crowds that watched from shore maintained respectful silence, recognizing the ceremony's solemnity even if they did not understand its religious significance. As Cook's weighted remains sank into the Pacific waters that had been his true home for over a decade, the expedition faced the question of what to do next. Their commander's unfinished mission, the search for the Northwest Passage, remained valid, but continuing it would require leadership qualities that none of his subordinates could claim to possess. Cook had been irreplaceable, and his death left the expedition rudderless in hostile waters, far from any hope of assistance. Charles Clerke, dying of tuberculosis but determined to honor Cook's memory, made the decision that defined his own legacy. The expedition would continue northward, completing the Arctic exploration that Cook had planned for the summer of 1779. If the Northwest Passage existed and could be found, Cook's death would not have been in vain. If it proved elusive, at least the attempt would demonstrate that British exploration had not ended with the loss of its greatest practitioner. The departure from Hawaii was somber rather than triumphant. The islands that had welcomed Cook as a god now watched his ships sail away carrying his bones and his shattered reputation. The Hawaiians had learned that Europeans, despite their impressive technology, were mortals who could be killed by traditional weapons wielded with sufficient courage. The Europeans had learned that superior firepower could not guarantee survival in situations where cultural misunderstanding created irreconcilable conflicts. The final Arctic voyage of Cook's third expedition proved to be a futile gesture rather than a meaningful exploration. Clerke, weakening daily from his disease, managed to sail north to the ice barriers that had stopped Cook the previous summer, but he lacked the strength and experience to push beyond them. The Northwest Passage remained as elusive as ever, and Clerke's deteriorating health made further attempts impossible. Charles Clerke died on August 22, 1779, 6 months after Cook's death, leaving command of the expedition to Lieutenant John Gore. The ships finally turned toward home, their mission incomplete and their most distinguished members dead. The voyage that was supposed to crown Cook's career with the greatest geographical discovery of all time had instead ended his life and failed to achieve its primary objective. The return to England in October 1780 brought news of Cook's death to a nation that had celebrated him as its greatest explorer. The public reaction combined genuine grief with shocked disbelief that someone of Cook's stature could be killed by people armed with primitive weapons. Cook had seemed invincible, protected by superior knowledge and technology that made him master of any situation he encountered. The official investigation into Cook's death reached conclusions that protected his reputation while acknowledging the tragedy's complexity. Cook had died performing his duty, attempting to maintain order in a difficult situation that had spiraled beyond anyone's control. The Hawaiians had acted defensively rather than aggressively, protecting their chief from what they perceived as kidnapping. Both sides had behaved according to their own cultural logic, creating a collision that ended in unnecessary bloodshed, but the deeper questions raised by Cook's death would trouble scholars and moralists for generations. Had exploration become a form of cultural violence that inevitably led to conflict between Europeans and indigenous peoples? Could the benefits of geographical discovery justify the human costs that contact imposed on previously isolated societies? Was Cook's death a tragic accident or the inevitable consequence of assumptions about European superiority that could not be sustained when challenged by determined resistance? The Hawaiian islands that Cook had discovered and named would eventually become strategic outposts in the American empire, their indigenous culture gradually overwhelmed by foreign settlement and economic exploitation. The peoples who had killed Cook would themselves be conquered by diseases, weapons, and political systems that European contact had introduced to their previously isolated world. Cook's death had not prevented the colonization that his discoveries had made possible. It had merely delayed the process by which Pacific islands were incorporated into global empires. Cook's charts and journals survived his death to guide generations of navigators through waters he had pioneered. His methods of preventing scurvy saved thousands of lives on subsequent voyages. His diplomatic approaches to indigenous peoples, despite their ultimate failure in Hawaii, established precedents that other explorers followed with greater success. Even in death, Cook continued to influence the age of exploration that his achievements had inaugurated. The cottage in Yorkshire, where Cook had been born, continued to shelter farm laborers who had never heard their neighbors' names spoken in the drawing rooms of London or the councils of Pacific chiefs. The North Sea waters where he had learned seamanship continued to challenge sailors who possessed a fraction of his skill. The Pacific Ocean that had become his true home continued to hide islands that no European had discovered, passages that no navigator had charted, peoples who had never seen foreign faces. But the age of exploration that Cook had dominated was ending. The great geographical mysteries had been solved, the major ocean routes had been charted, and the blank spaces on maps had been filled with coastlines drawn by surveyors who followed techniques that Cook had perfected. Future exploration would seek different objectives: the Earth's interior rather than its surface, the depths of oceans rather than their extent, the mechanisms of nature rather than the boundaries of continents. James Cook died as he had lived, pursuing geographical knowledge that expanded human understanding of the world's true dimensions. The farm laborer's son who had risen to international fame through methodical competence and diplomatic skill had transformed exploration from haphazard adventure into systematic science. His 3 voyages had connected every inhabited place on Earth into a single navigational system for the first time in human history. The boy who had stared longingly at ships in Whitby Harbor had sailed farther than any person before him, mapped more of the Earth's surface than anyone who had ever lived, and opened the Pacific to European eyes. His death on a beach in Hawaii marked the end of the greatest career in the history of exploration, but it also marked the beginning of the modern world that his discoveries had made inevitable. The waves that washed over James Cook's blood on the volcanic sand of Kealakekua Bay carried it into the Pacific Ocean that had been his true home for over a decade. Somewhere in those vast waters, diluted beyond detection but still present, molecules that had once been part of the greatest explorer in human history continue to circulate through currents that he charted, past islands that he discovered, toward shores that he mapped with precision that endures to this day. The Pacific remembers James Cook. Every ship that follows routes he pioneered, every navigator who uses techniques he perfected, every chart that bears names he bestowed carries forward the legacy of a man who transformed the Earth from a collection of unknown continents into a single, interconnected world. He died trying to maintain the relationships between cultures that his own discoveries had brought into contact, and his death reminds us that exploration is never merely about geography. It is about the human consequences of connecting worlds that were never meant to meet. In the end, James Cook achieved the immortality that had always eluded him in life. Not the divine status that Hawaiians briefly accorded him, but the more lasting fame that comes from changing human understanding in ways that can never be reversed. The world we inhabit today, connected by shipping routes he charted, governed by nations whose Pacific territories he discovered, informed by scientific methods he pioneered, is James Cook's true monument. The farm laborer's son from Yorkshire died as he had lived, reaching beyond the known world toward horizons that beckoned with the promise of discovery. That he found death instead of the Northwest Passage does not diminish his achievement. He had already done enough to earn his place among the greatest figures in human history. The boy who had once mucked out stables had become the man who gave the modern world its true dimensions. Thank you for joining us on this extraordinary journey across the Pacific with Captain James Cook. If you found this exploration of history's greatest navigator compelling, please subscribe to Michael's Expeditions for more stories of the remarkable individuals who shaped our understanding of the world. Their adventures remind us that the boundaries of human achievement are limited only by our willingness to sail toward unknown horizons, regardless of the storms that may await us there.